In the last video, we have seen how Deleuze develops in Chapter 2 of Difference and Repetition the three syntheses of time, in parallel with the doctrine of the faculties. What we did not discuss, however, is Deleuze's description of consciousness and the unconscious. But upon rereading this passage, I thought it could be interesting to give it a quick look, because it reveals some interesting points about Deleuze's philosophy. As is often the case when it comes to psychology-related matters, Deleuze begins with a discussion on Freud, and in particular on Freud's shift from the pleasure principle towards the death instinct. Early in his career, Freud came up with the notion that pleasure is the main focus of psychological life, is the reason why we do things. And consciousness, in this regard, is the tool that the unconscious uses to reach pleasure. But a problem arose when Freud took note of a strange fact which this principle could not explain, namely the repetition compulsion, which is the unconscious tendency to repeat a traumatic event that he observed in so many soldiers who came back traumatized from World War I. This unconscious tendency is literally the opposite of the search for pleasure, and Freud was puzzled. So in the 1920s he came up with a more profound overarching principle, the famous death drive, which supposedly explains our chaotic and self-destructive tendencies, as well as our compulsion to repeat past traumas. This is the famous feud between Eros, which is life-giving, and Thanatos, who is death. Deleuze's critique of this understanding is quite simple. Freud presupposes what he is trying to explain. He is giving himself a principle which supposedly explains empirical life, when in fact it's the conditions found in empirical life that must explain the principle. Furthermore, Freud is giving himself a principle which implies, rather than explains, egocentrism, in the form of a reality principle opposed to the pleasure principle. But as Deleuze says, there is no need to speak of an egocentrism on the part of the child. Neither the pleasure principle nor the ego can explain psychological life. They are, on the contrary, what must be explained, and this is what Deleuze does in this section. As we have seen, Deleuze argues that psychological life begins in habit formation. Similarly, the self is not given in advance but is formed by contemplation, and this is why Deleuze can reverse Freud's view. Habit, in the form of a passive binding synthesis, precedes the pleasure principle and renders it possible. Of course, Deleuze is not denying that we are sometimes led by the search for pleasure, but this is not the effect of a principle or an ego. Occasionally, we may empirically experience repetition as subordinated to a pleasure obtained or to be obtained, but in the order of conditions, the relation is reversed. In the order of conditions, that is, it is the pleasure obtained or to be obtained which is subordinated to repetition. But of course, at this point, what Deleuze must explain really is what the order of conditions is. So he discusses at length the process of how children learn to walk, and his first point is that this process implies a complementary back and forth between passivity and activity. A child who begins to walk does not only bind excitations in a passive synthesis, even supposing that these were endogenous excitations born of its own movements. No one has ever walked endogenously. Activity and passivity are the two centers, the 2 points of focus in a child's life, but neither is the ego itself. The ego, rather, is the passage between these two centers. On the one hand, the child goes beyond the bound excitations, which are the passive syntheses, towards the supposition of the intentionality of an object, the active syntheses, such as the mother, as the goal of an effort, the end to be actively reached in reality and in relation to which success and failure may be measured. But on the other hand, and at the same time, the child constructs for itself another object, a quite different kind of object, which is a virtual object, or center, and which then governs and compensates for the progresses and the failures of its real activity. So the child essentially goes back and forth between these two centers, the real one which sets goals and tries to reach them, and the virtual one which ponders and measures this activity. So far there is no need for a given self, and as a matter of fact Deleuze explains that the self is formed in between these two centers. In virtue of their dissimilarity, perhaps a crossing, a twist, a helix, or a figure 8 is even formed between the two centers. What then would be the ego? Where would it be, given its topological distinction from the id, if not at the crossing of the 8, at the point of connection between these two intersecting asymmetrical circles, the circle of real objects and that of the virtual objects or centers? These two series or circles are complementary, even though they are distinct and disjunctive. While the virtual object is about the past, about memory, the real object is all about anticipation of future interactions. While the pure past qualifies the virtual object, which as we have seen happens in a passive synthesis of memory, it will affect the series of the real, investing or binding real objects with the elements of memory. This is what Deleuze calls the object equals X. The symbol is the always displaced fragment, standing for a past which was never present. The object equals X. So what Deleuze opposes to Freud ultimately is a genetic conception in which the self is formed in the passage between the two disjunctive series of the past and the future, that is, contemplation and action. This view does not require any given ego or pleasure principle, and it is also why Deleuze is not a materialist. Experience or reality does not begin in matter, but in the relations that produce the genesis of the self and reality. We have seen that an important point to be explained is repetition compulsions induced by traumas. In Freud's theory, the fact that I may feel anxiety here and now is due to a past trauma that repeats itself in the present because the present situation resembles the circumstances in which the trauma occurred. This is a persuasive model, but Deleuze criticizes it as follows. Freud's theory states that the repressed trauma finds a way to disguise itself in the present event, because the present event resembles the circumstances of the past trauma. I repeat the trauma because I repress it. But in fact, Deleuze explains, I do not repeat because I repress because I repeat. Which is to say that the cause of the present anxiety is not the past event itself, which supposedly disguises itself in the present circumstances. The past does not exist except as a memory, which is itself part of a present and real series. Here's what Deleuze says. Repetition is constituted only with and through the disguises which affect the terms and relations of the real series. But it is so because it depends upon the virtual object as an immanent instance which operates above all by displacement. In consequence, we cannot suppose that disguise may be explained by repression. On the contrary, it is because repetition is necessarily disguised by virtue of the characteristic displacement of its determinant principle that repression occurs in the form of a consequence in regard to the representation of presence. And because repetition is a disguise, because both series, virtual and actual, are in the present moment, it becomes impossible to say which is the cause and which is the effect. This creates a circuit. If the two presents, the former and the present one, form two series which coexist in the function of the virtual object which is displaced in them and in relation to itself, neither of these two series can any longer be designated as the original or the derived. So in other words, it's not the past which causes the present, nor the present the past. The present of repetition is the displacement which symbolically affects the virtual object, and the many disguises which affect real objects imaginarily. But precisely what is this disguise or mask exactly? Interestingly, it is closely linked to the problematic, meaning the process by which we desire. Behind the masks, therefore, are further masks, and even the most hidden is still a hiding place, and so on to infinity. The only illusion is that of unmasking something or someone. Ultimately, conscience is not a tool for the unconscious to reach pleasure. Rather, the difference between consciousness and the unconscious is about modes of perception. The unconscious, Deleuze says, is differential, involving little perceptions, and as such it is different in kind from consciousness. It concerns problems and questions which can never be reduced to the great oppositions or the overall effects that are felt in consciousness. As for the death instinct, which was Freud's upgrade of the pleasure principle, Deleuze links it to the third synthesis, where the illusions of the intellect occur. The third synthesis, however, refers to the absence of ground into which we are precipitated by the ground itself. Thanatos appears in the third place, as this groundlessness, beyond the ground of eros and the foundation of habitus. He therefore has a disturbing kind of relation with the pleasure principle which is often expressed in the unfathomable paradoxes of a pleasure linked to pain. The masochism that Deleuze here refers to is not the ability to derive pleasure from pain, but rather it's a cold calculation made by reason, which is why Deleuze calls it pure, cold, apathetic, and frozen thought. This is to say that in the third synthesis, mental or libidinal energy can be reallocated to abstract domains which sometimes border on insanity. Of course, masochism is not the only illusion perpetrated by reason. Even if it is a spectacular one, it's nothing compared to the metaphysical illusions in which we tend to live. For example, what could be crazier than a concept which subsumes everything that exists? And yet, there is such a concept. As Deleuze says, it is said that the one subjugated the multiple once and for all. But is this not the face of death? Of course, death in this context means the overgeneralization, the eternal repetition of the same, which is often what happens when reason takes over the mind. So the undoing of these illusions is a vital task, and it will be the main object of the eternal return, as we will see later in our study. So in summary, we have seen that consciousness is formed out of the relation between two series, the real active one and the virtual passive one. Out of their interaction, which is effectuated by the symbolic or virtual object, emerge the active syntheses of time, active memory and intellection. which have the power to reinvest mental energy on points of interest, like paradoxes of problems, or indeed fail and produce crazy outcomes. This is, in a nutshell, the basis of desire, which focuses on what Deleuze calls the problematic. I thought this was an interesting set of points to be made, and certainly we will talk about them again later in our study. For now, thank you for watching, and see you soon.